glad to have you here. We have a pretty full agenda. Before we get started, I'll just review some logistics. If we need to leave this room in a hurry, in an emergency, there are emergency exits to my left, be at the very back of the room, and then of course out these doors that you came in, and to the right there are exits outside. The restrooms, if you haven't located them yet, go out the main doors here, down the hall that you came in from the sign-in area. About halfway down, you'll turn left, and the restrooms are on that little branch corridor. There is also a kitchen break room to the right of that, on that corridor, where you will find vending machines if you need something to keep you going through this meeting. Just a note that we don't schedule a break because we want to use every possible moment of this time that we have together. So if you members need to take care of issues, just feel free to do that at your convenience. Another note on logistics is you'll recall, those of you who were here last time, that the meeting was videoed and then was available after the meeting. We have now upgraded, and now we will be live streaming. So anybody that tunes into the website will be able to watch this meeting as we go. And so I have been asked, one of the things that we used last time, which is a pretty typical tradition, is to use your tent card to signify that you'd like to be called on. And we're going to continue to do that. However, as soon as I call on you, please be sure to put your tent card back down so those watching know who you are. Because otherwise all of our viewers will be doing this or this, and it just might be uncomfortable for them. So I'll try to remember that and remind you, and if we can all work on that, that would be great. And so I forgot to say we're getting ready to go. Are we okay? Sorry. Let's start with introductions. And where did I start? I think I started to my right last time. I'll start to my left this time.
Good morning, Chris Strickler, Washington State DOT.
Good morning, Marie Dodds, AAA, Oregon, Idaho.
Yes, you have to push to talk, and then you push it off after you're done.
Chris Hagerbaumer, Oregon Environmental Council.
Phil Ditzler, Federal Highway Administration.
Paul Savas, Clackamas County.
Brendan Finn, City of Portland.
Ann McInerney-Ogle, Mayor-elect for the City of Vancouver.
Garrett Kransky with the Street Trust.
Park Woodworth Ride Connection.
Orlando Simpson, Oregon Transportation Commission.
Sean O'Halloran, Oregon Transportation Commission.
Curtis Robinholt from the Port of Portland.
Jessica Vega-Peterson from the Multnomah County Commission, and I have to leave a little early today because we have our board meeting this morning, so I just wanted to let everybody know that.
Brian Winsheimer, ODOT Region 1.
Eileen Quiring, Clark County Council.
Pam Treese, Westside Economic Alliance.
Craig Dirksen, Metro Council and JPAC Chair.
Marion Haynes, Portland Business Alliance.
Janet Jarvis, Oregon Trucking Association.
I'm Judith Gray, I'm the Project Manager for ODOT.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much to our audience who are here excuse me, to observe this meeting. We really appreciate your interest and your attention. We will always have an opportunity for public comment at our meetings. This morning we're going to do it early at the beginning of the meeting so that the committee members have the opportunity to hear from the public before we get started. So we'll come to that here shortly. I would like to ask at this point in time if your co-chairs would like to make any opening remarks this morning. Alando, Sean?
Great, thanks, Penny. Welcome again, everybody. Meeting number 2. I think we're almost there. 3 more to go, or four more to go?
4 more.
Yeah. So good as we close out 17. But again, I'm just honored to be a part of this process again, and I'm fully excited about the opportunity to engage in this conversation around options related to our congestion issues here in the Portland metropolitan region. And I'll continue to echo that, this forum, I think, is more about all the constituents and stakeholders at this table, as well as, more importantly, the public and their commentary about what are going to be some of the most pragmatic, practical, and reasonable and beneficial solutions for our region in order to minimize some of our congestion concerns as we've been directed by the legislature to do. So, again, thank you all again for being here. And for those that weren't here for the first meeting, definitely looking forward to hearing your voices today. So thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. And again, I want to welcome everyone to this advisory committee. And I think since the last conversation, there has been a great deal of input into how we move forward. And I think it's important to keep in mind that congestion pricing is not to be considered in isolation. And this process is to help us make a determination on whether or not it is feasible as directed by the state legislature in law, now that we have a transportation package in place. I think it's critical to pull in all the stakeholders to help us get a frame of reference on that, and that we have to look at the entirety of the system and our options, which include transit and cycling, and making sure that we are looking at it system-wide as directed by the legislature, and then getting as much information as we can to make a decision, which remains an Oregon Transportation Commission decision. And that this process is to inform us to do exactly that. And so I want to thank everyone for the energy and input and the passion that's going into this. We continue to try to pull the information together so that we can get to a direction moving forward and bubble it up to the commission for decision. But I just want to thank everyone, and I think since the last meeting, there's been a great deal of input, and we will do our best to reach consensus and move forward. And but also realizing that not everybody is going to be happy here, because we've got people on entirely opposite sides of the spectrum in terms of position. But it is our intent to move forward, make a decision, and go from there. But thank you for the input.
Thank you very much. And I realize I jumped to your co-chairs a little early, but I wanted to hear from them right away. I did want to review the agenda. And as I said, we have a pretty busy meeting. We have our comments from our PAC co-chairs. We'll have public comment. We're going to revisit the charter, the comments that you provided at the last meeting, a revised version, and then hope to finalize it today. You'll hear some about the public engagement process that is kicking off. We'll revisit the concept evaluation and performance measures, and Kirsten will share what changes have been made since the last meeting. And then the new topic for today will be initial concepts for evaluation. What actually should be evaluated in this process, in this feasibility analysis. So again, a lot to talk about. Before we do public comment, I would like to note that we circulated a summary of meeting number 1, and we didn't get any comments back on it. Is everybody all right with it, or does anybody have any issues with the summary? Did it meet your needs? Did it help you remember what was talked about? And any objections to us making that final, so we can post it on the website and have it be a final documentation of meeting number 1? Okay, we will do that, and that is the process that we will follow with all meeting summaries. Okay, with that, I would like to turn to public comment. I have 4 people right now. No, I have 2 more. Oh, it's the same one. I have 2 people signed up for public comment, so we have reserved a bit more time this meeting. However, because we started quite early, I'm going to take a little bit of liberty, and I'm going to try and reserve about 5 minutes near the end of the meeting, so that if people come in late, they'll still have an opportunity to make public comments. So I'm going to cut our public comment period a little short, as we only have 2 people right now. So I would like to ask John Lay and then Joe Cartwright to make their public comment. Please keep your comments to a couple of minutes, and then again, that will allow us to reserve some time for the end of the meeting. John Lay.
Good morning, John Lee from Camas. I would hope you would ask the question and keep it at the core of everything you do for the next 6 months. Where's the value for the average citizen? If this is truly attempting to solve problems rather than be a money grab by the state, then we truly want to reduce congestion in the area. If you're doing that, I would hope you would be able to ask and answer questions for citizens. First and foremost, how many new lanes need to be added to uncongest current roads and highways? ODOT's got the data on how many cars there already are. We know an average highway lane carries about 1,800 cars and trucks an hour. It's simple math, and we ought to have an answer. What would we need to build right now to make our roads uncongested? Number two, because this package from the legislature does not add any new capacity, it's not going to fix congestion problems by adding capacity, with the exception of I-205 from Stafford Road to the Abernathy Bridge. Therefore, the next question becomes, how many cars need to be removed from the roads in order to eliminate congestion? Again, it's simple math. How many lanes are there? How many cars can we have on those lanes before it gets congested? It's a great metric of how many cars need to be removed. Once you have that, then you can begin looking at what sort of financial pain or incentive do you need to begin inflicting on drivers to encourage them to move off the roads. Finally, you would then be able to provide citizens where are those cars likely to go when they get off the highways due to the incentive you've provided or the financial pain. Where are they likely to go, and what's that going to do to their neighborhoods? And finally, I would ask, once you get the answers to those questions, tell it to the people, the taxpayers, the people that will be footing the bill, and ask them the core question: do you believe there is value in this? They'll tell all of us, and if their answer is yes, move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Sorry I slaughtered your last name. Joe Courtwright.
Good morning. Thank you. My name is Joe Courtwright. I'm with City Observatory, which is an urban policy think tank. And we've spent a lot of time looking at transportation issues and road pricing in particular. And as an economist, I want to say we're at an inflection point right now. We know that there's big change in the transportation system with the advent of ride sharing, with autonomous vehicles and so on. And just as a century ago, we replaced the system, a horse and buggy system, and I would note that we didn't license horses and we didn't tax hay to pay for roads. But when the transportation system changed, we implemented a new way of paying for things. And this is our opportunity as the transportation system is changing to put in place a fundamental change and an opportunity to make Portland a leader. And as every economist will tell you, the only solution to congestion is road pricing. We know that if you don't price roads in an urban environment, the demand for them will overwhelm their capacity. It does not matter how many additional lanes that you build. Go to Houston, where they expanded their Katy Freeway to 23 lanes. And after 2 years, it was more congested than before they expanded it. The only way you're going to solve congestion is by implementing road pricing. And I would just suggest that maybe what you want to do is change the name of this committee, because this congestion pricing isn't about inflicting pain on people. It's about making the transportation system work better. And if you're in the business of selling this to people, you need to change the name of your committee to the Congestion Elimination Committee, because this is the only thing that will have any effect on that. So call it the Smart Transportation Committee or the Next Generation Technology Committee. The other thing I would say is, do not miss the opportunity to save the state of Oregon billions of dollars on unneeded transportation capacity. If you were to implement pricing on the existing roadway system, you would suddenly discover that we have plenty of capacity already, and that we do not need in the Portland metropolitan area to spend an additional $1 billion on highway widening. But whether you believe that or not, implementing pricing means that every forecast for traffic volumes in the Portland metropolitan area is wrong, because all of the forecasts we have now are predicated on an unpriced road system. So it doesn't make any sense to move ahead with any major investments until after we've implemented pricing and seen what the effects are, because people will behave very differently in a world of pricing. The other issue I wanted to touch on briefly was equity, because I know there's a lot of concern about that. And a lot of times we talk about the ability to pay principle, which is an important public finance principle. But we also need to think about, in terms of equity, the benefit principle. Who uses the system people who use the system ought to pay for the system. And that's manifestly not the case with the way that we finance transportation in Oregon now. We impose lots of costs on people who do not use the system, and we don't reflect back to users the cost of the system that they use. So I would urge you in your equity discussions not just to focus on the marginal impacts of pricing, but to think about the overall equity of our transportation finance system in Oregon. And it is not equitable. It is not equitable at all. It charges people who do not use the system much more than the costs that they impose, and it doesn't charge the people who use it what they reflect, what the cost they actually cause. Let me give you an example. If you drive less than 10,000 miles a year in Oregon, you pay more in vehicle registration fees than you pay in gas taxes. You only pay about 2 cents a mile in gas taxes. So the vehicle reg fee for most people is our biggest source of transportation finance. And it's not related in any way to our ability to pay. A 10-year-old Subaru pays just as much in a registration fee as a brand new Mercedes. And that 10-year-old Subaru pays about 20 times the tax rate on a per value basis as a new SUV. And that big SUV essentially causes 8 times as much road wear. So if you're concerned about equity, as you should be, don't just look at what the incremental change is to the system. Look at the overall system, because the system we have now is not fair on either a benefit principle or an ability to pay principle. Finally, I would stress to you that, while you've focused on feasibility, I don't think there's any question about the feasibility of road pricing. Leading cities around the world, London, Singapore, Milan, Stockholm, have all implemented pricing. It is very feasible. The legislature has directed you to do pricing. So it's not a question of whether it's feasible or whether it's even a good idea. I think the legislature has told you that it's a good idea. This is an opportunity to fundamentally change the way we approach transportation in a way that will make the system work better, that will save the public billions of dollars, and can make our system much more equitable and efficient than it is now. So I'm very excited to see this task force convened. I think you have a great opportunity to move Oregon forward, make us a leader, and dramatically improve the way we do transportation. So if I can be of any help to you in this process, I'll be happy to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I also have James Franson.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, committee members. I'm here because I have never seen tollways work but in a few places. I'm only here to contest the tollways. I'm here to see if I can stop it in its tracks. The reason being, I've seen too much corruption. Congestion pricing is an oxymoron. All you're going to do is increase congestion, drive the public off of the tollway onto the private streets, create more wear and tear. A couple of places I have seen tolling work, San Diego Coronado Bay Bridge, because it was written into the statute that when the bridge is paid for, the tolls come down. Hood Canal Bridge was done the same way in the 50s. Unfortunately, it sank, and then they rebuilt it, put up another tollway on it again. Well, a private citizen sued and said, no, we paid for the tollway already. Now it should be insurance that covers it. Well, the court agreed, forced the state to take down the toll. If you toll for congestion, you got to build a huge, if you have a 3-lane freeway, you got to have about a dozen toll booths. Again, a major expense. I'm of the opinion that having had to drive back east, lived in one of the most corrupt areas in Illinois, seen the communities that had, for instance, the Illinois Tollway Authority took out bonds from local communities to fund the Tri-State Tollway. Well, the Illinois Tollway Authority didn't pay the municipalities back. They had to sue to get their funding back. You can't drive on the East Coast, in Jersey, around Pennsylvania, without being horribly tolled. And I'm of the opinion that I want to be able to drive from Vancouver, BC, to Tijuana, Mexico, and not pay a single toll. Now, if you want to build a bridge, and you want to toll the bridge until the bridge is paid for, that's fine. You can do that. You also have the purview to toll any state and local roads you choose. But the Eisenhower Tollway, the Eisenhower Freeway system is funded by federal dollars, weight per mile taxes for semis, and gas taxes from the private citizen. I'm completely against tolling any federal highway. So I've already reached out to Jamie Herrera Butler. 20 years ago in 1997, I said the same thing to the metro community, and tollways weren't mentioned again for 10 years. Well, I haven't gone anywhere, ladies and gentlemen. Please don't consider tolling. It's not going to work, and it's just going to make things a lot worse. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Any other folks interested in making public comment at this time? Okay. Oh, go ahead.
Madam and co-chairs, my name is Rich Weil. I'm a state legislator for Oregon. I serve as co-vice chair on the House Transportation Committee. I was not going to say anything this morning, but since you have a few minutes, let me make a couple of observations. This is a critical conversation. The need that we have to find alternative means of financing transportation in Oregon is clear. And one of the reasons why this is such an important conversation is because what you do here may set the stage for future projects that will actually do something to solve some of our key problems. I represent a district on the west side, South Hillsborough, Sherwood, Wilsonville, and that whole swath of development that's actually putting about 100 houses a week into our system right now. It is a congested area that has folks very, very frustrated. And whether we solve our congestion in the I-5, 205 corridor or not, nothing that has been proposed is going to deal with the fact that to get freight and folks out of Washington County area, you've got to come down the Sunset, or you've got to go down 217. You've got to get out to I-5 before you can go anywhere, north or south. That is just simply not a good solution. In Colorado, the E-470 freeway, which is running on the east side of Denver, was financed without public money, is tolled, is a high toll, and is a very successful freeway. Freeway is a misnomer because it's certainly not free, but it has saved the downtown Denver system. I-25 is actually really working so much better now that E-470 is in place. I urge you to recognize that I believe your co-chairs have it absolutely correct when they say the legislature has spoken. We need to input user pricing on our roadways in order to test just what the public's capacity and appetite is for getting improvements. This is the test. If we institute it correctly and it works like we hope it will be the thing that allows us to look at future improvements that might really address the problems. Co-Chair O'Halloran is correct. All of us recognize this is not just a road conversation. But folks, we have tried a lot of other things, and none of them have solved our road congestion issues. We absolutely need to address road congestion as part of the conversation that we're dealing with here in Oregon. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else for I'll get to the committee here in a bit. Anyone else for public comment? Thank you. And I just want to remind those of you in the audience that there are other ways, if you don't choose to make oral comment. There are comment forms that you can fill out here today at the meeting. And you can also submit comments on the website and the address, and you can submit comments directly to the PAC. The email address for that is valuepricingpac, P-A-C, valuepricingpac at odot.state.or.us. Also, just a note for those in the audience, we did have a request at the last meeting to have wireless. It is available. There are signs posted around that have the wireless address and or server and password. And if you're searching for Wi-Fi, it should be under ODOT guest, and the password is Lone Rock, all one word with a capital L. With that, I'd like to turn to the committee and ask for some what you've been hearing from your constituents. I did want to point out you have 3 pieces of correspondence in front of you. One from Ann McNerney Ogle, thank you, feedback from her constituents. You also have a letter from Craig Dirksen, another member of the committee, and a letter from Neil McFarlane from TriMet, who could not be here today, but provided his thoughts about the various agenda items. In the next 4 or 5 minutes, other thoughts from the committee about what you've been hearing from your constituents. And I saw Ann was up. Are you going, Kate?
Thank you, Penny. All I wanted to add was the fact that I've given those pieces of information to Judith for the files.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. The other thing I failed to note was that you also had in your packet, and we'll have each time, the entire transcripts of all the comments that have been received at that PAC email address. So hopefully you're finding that useful as well. So a lot of information coming to you. Paul.
Thank you. There's a lot of terms I've heard last meeting and since then and even this morning. And I don't know if there's a chance for somewhere along the lines of, again, back to the education piece, if we can actually have understanding, at least a mutual understanding of what those terms are. I mean, I think the term I've been hearing lately is that we can solve congestion. And I've been schooled quite often that that's not really possible. We can maybe reduce congestion and maybe we can manage congestion. I think our purpose here is to help find a way to manage congestion. But if there's a silver bullet where you can solve congestion, I'm all ears. The other word I heard is equity. And I just want to say that if I was an elected commissioner in Multnomah County, I would certainly have a different perspective. And if I was an elected commissioner in Clark County or Washington County, we would all have different perspectives. And our constituents probably think differently because of their particular situation, perhaps where they work and how they commute. But I think that we've really had a system here that is very, very well established in some parts of the region and has a lot of capacity in ways, but does not in other areas. That really lacks. And you know, I would say in Clackamas County, really, we have an undersized, underinvested system, and we have bottlenecks. I don't think that bottlenecks are synonymous with increasing or adding lanes. Granted, technically, yeah, I suppose we are. You would add a lane where the bottleneck, where there isn't one. But I think those terms are can be misunderstood or misused, and maybe that would be expanded into we're actually expanding we're suggesting a lot of freeways are going to be expanded just for the sake of expanding, adding lanes. And I don't know, and maybe that's appropriate in certain cases. I mean, I assume that's part of the scope of work here, but I just think that word equity and where we're standing and our positions and our comments are really about our constituents. And we were asked to talk to our constituents, and I do that frequently. And last night was no exception. And I really believe that there is a strong, overwhelming majority of people that want to see some investment, some key investments in areas that can improve or reduce those bottlenecks. And the other thing I'll say, there's a term that we need to come out here with also, it's throughput. We talk about congestion and we talk about capacity, but it's really about throughput. And that's something else I was schooled on. And that's really gets bound to economics. And economics is terribly important if we're going to work towards a viable, thriving economy. And I think that's where the freight folks come in as well. But I'll stop there. I didn't know that we'd have an opportunity. My initial comment was to make sure that at least we can have an opportunity ourselves to not necessarily respond, but at least speak to where we are today. So I appreciate that opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Penny, real quick, as over here. As Commissioner Salvas was mentioning, it seemed like we're pretty teed up today to kind of dive into a lot of the issues he just mentioned related to performance metrics, and I want to make sure that we have enough time today to obviously get into that, because it can get very widespread. But I also want to make sure that we actually use today, again, to tee that up, but also to provide opportunity to, going into the next meeting to make sure that everybody's on the same page as it relates to the performance measurements we should be looking at and considering as a result of this, this group's conversation.
Thanks. Brandon.
Thanks, Penny. Just by means of a quick update, last Thursday, Portland City Council had a public hearing on a resolution that is basically supports this effort. It was a great, robust public hearing. I want to thank the members of the committee that attended and testified in support. Appreciate that. And I just wanted to inform the committee that City Council did unanimously support that resolution that underliningly just supports our effort here to come up with a value pricing solution. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Anyone else hearing anything you want to bring up from your constituents? Okay, so we will try to have this on the agenda each meeting, so know that we will be asking you that question each time, so that'll give you the opportunity to think about that and prepare ahead of time. And with that, we are exactly on schedule, so I am going to move us along to our first substantive agenda item, and that has to do with the charter. I'm trying to remember which buttons to push here. And thank you for those of you who responded via email. You do have two versions of the charter in your packet. The first has the track changes for changes that have been made since the last meeting, and then the second is a clean version. I would suggest let's look at the track changes. I want to just briefly highlight where things were changed, and then we'll see how we're doing. Craig, did you want to start, or do you want me to go through it and highlight the changes first? Okay, all right. So if you're following along, we have a suggestion that was in the handout that, well, no, I'll come to that in a moment here. Let me see here. Where we had suggestions for changes, page 2 of the charter, at the very top of the page, the addition of to inform the commission's proposal rather than prior to applying to. I think that's just really a more accurate way of stating what the process is. You asked about why did we have plural ex officios when the Washington State Department of Transportation was changed to a member instead of ex officio, so we've cleaned that all up. You now have an ex officio member, Phil, and we've made sure that that is reflected throughout the charter. There was also a lot of discussion and comment on the top of page 3 on the bullet financing bottleneck relief projects. A lot of suggestions made about that, and we got more suggestions via email, so we're going to come back to that. Further down on the page, considering the following factors, about third bullet up from the bottom, consistency with state law and policy, regional plans were added in. On page 4, there was a suggestion that as this is an advisory committee, not a decision-making committee, that having decision-making process seemed a bit misleading, so we changed that section header to committee recommendation development process. You also had expressed concerns about being limited to only the 3 items, the 3 bullet items, and while those are a definite ask from the OTC, what we added was recommendations will, at a minimum, address the following questions. And then there's more cleaning up about the ex officio. You said that they should not take part in any votes, but they certainly could provide their insight or expertise if asked in the development of either minority or majority statements. And I think the only other major change on the bottom of page 5 is that materials provided to the members will also be posted on the project website. So those are the changes that were made as a result of the last meeting and comments received. Let me see, I saw Craig go up and then Ann. Go ahead, Craig.
Thank you. A further clarification on the reference to consistency with state law and policy, and they added and regional plans. But if you refer back to the pages on objectives, on page 3 of the objectives under Portland area value pricing considerations, the preamble there is the charter identifies the following 10 considerations. And then under consistency with state, et cetera, it's actually been changed to say consistency with state and regional law and policy, and then on the in the last phrase, and regional planning regulations. And since this refers back to what's in the charter, I think the language of those two paragraphs should be consistent, and I would request that the language as it's placed in the objectives should be the same, that should be what is in the charter as well.
Okay, noted. Thank you very much. Yeah. Ann?
Thank you, Penny, and thank you for changing or adding that in one little section, or other roadway projects. That makes a big difference there. I wonder if the committee will go back to page 1, the very last bullet, purpose of the committee. That first word is determining. Since this is an advisory group, I'm wondering if perhaps the change should be considering instead of determining. That does take more analysis and study, and that is the role of the NEPA process. I'm wondering if considering would be a better choice of words there.
Any concerns with that around the table? Yeah. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
And Judith, when I say any concerns, I will actually ask, consider your concerns as well. So feel free to speak up if the project team has any concerns. Other thoughts about this? I know that we got correspondence about, we did get correspondence about that financing bottleneck relief projects, and trying to remember who they were from. Jessica, I knew they were from you.
Oh, yeah, this was just reiteration through email of what I had brought up last time, where it seems that to call out other roadway, or such as new freeway lanes or other roadway projects, just seems to channel us into a decision or a topic that doesn't need to be there, and it might be easier and read cleaner if that was just taken out completely.
Yeah, and we got that from you and also from others, and and having given it some thought and talked with Judith and the team and so forth, I would like to propose that get changed, and see what you think about this, if this helps. That the sentence would actually read, value pricing used as a means to finance the construction of roadway infrastructure, strike such as new freeway lanes, strike other roadway projects, and strike address identified bottlenecks. So it will just say, used as a means to finance the construction of roadway infrastructure that will improve the efficient movement of goods and people. Which broadens it. It doesn't put any specific suggestions. It leaves it open, which is exactly what the purpose is here, is to look at different things.
I think it's good. Why don't you change roadway to just transportation? And then I think you've captured it.
Transportation infrastructure instead of roadway?
Yep.
Thoughts about that? Anybody have any concerns with that? Paul, are you up on this?
Yeah, well, first of all, one point of order, because the page numbers are different on the two different documents, I'm trying to keep up with everyone when someone calls out a page number. So but I want to better understand the intent. So to Sean's suggestion first, I guess, is that I'd be concerned that the task here is 2 roadways that we're supposed to focus on, I-5 and 205. So I'd be concerned that might be misunderstood as to we're going to be looking at other.
I'm ambivalent. So
okay.
Either way, it's still this is the charter, right, for this working group, and I think so. How we address it, I think there's always going to be some element of gray. I know what we're trying to do here, and the semantics of it, I think, are important. But at the end of the day, we know how it's going to bubble up for a decision, and I think so. I'm ambivalent on that.
Yeah, I don't mind. So going back to Commissioner Peterson's suggestion as she broached that, I would be a little bit concerned that might be misconstrued for people outside this room, particularly. So I want to better understand the intent and make sure our intent. So I kind of reluctant to take that out because that's one of the things that are keeping some of my folks in my area hopeful that something positive will come out of this process, and because a freeway bottleneck is a major issue. We do not have a level playing field in our region, and that is one issue that it's just a hot burning issue for us. So I'd be concerned that might be misconstrued, but including language or broadening it, I'm open to.
How would you like it to read?
I didn't come prepared to wordsmith it. So now, which page shall I be on?
Well, we're on the version with the track changes. You're on page 3 at the top of the page. If you're following along in another version, it's under committee responsibilities and under the 2 bullets under committee responsibilities, and it's the last bullet. And the proposal was value pricing used as a means to finance the construction of roadway or transportation infrastructure that will improve the efficient movement of goods and people. So taking out all the such as language. And financing bottleneck relief projects is the topic, so it seems redundant to say it again. So that was the thinking behind this. I see a lot of cards up, and we didn't want to spend too much time on this, so let's take the cards really quickly and see where we get to on this. Jana, you were up and then you went back down? Okay. Okay, Marion?
So I just had a quick threshold question with respect to any revenues that could be generated potentially through this process. Would those,
can you pull your mic just a little closer, please? Thanks.
Would those be constitutionally, would those fit within the highway trust? So we are talking about roadway improvements. I think I'm fine taking out the such as. I think that leaves it open to include or not include, and that's the discussion that we're going to have. But I think just to be clear and transparent for everybody, making, acknowledging that this is going to be roadway improvements, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong.
So.
Judith, you have a microphone right there. To your left. To your left. Oh. Yes, all your own.
Well, I have one. Why can't I use it?
Here, thanks.
So it's my understanding, and that's the reason that the project team included the word roadway, was to be clear that this would be limited by the constitutional use of funds. But I certainly will defer to any constitutional scholars or our OTC members.
Thank you. Craig. Okay, Eileen?
Thank you.
Can you put your card down?
Yes.
Thank you. Mike, card?
I would just like to second what Mr. Savas commented about. I believe that it is important that we have roadways, that it is going toward roadways, and I think that broadening it to just plain transportation may be a little bit too narrow.
Okay, thank you.
The jury is instructed to disregard the previous comments.
All right, Craig, and then thank you, Chris. Craig.
I agree with the direction this is going. I would support Ms. Mabey's recommendation about striking the such as. It doesn't preclude any of those things. It just broadens our scope. It allows us to consider more options. But I would also agree that I think we should that including roadways should remain, because it is understood that because of restrictions on what we could use the money for, that is there. And I think we need to make clear to people who are reading what we're doing that is what our understanding is and what our focus will be.
Thank you, Craig.
So
Chris?
just keep in roadways and strike the such as.
Okay. Chris?
Indeed, the dollars will be restricted to uses within the roadway, but some things that can be funded within the Highway Trust Fund include other kinds of intelligent transportation system improvements. So it's not just, it wouldn't necessarily just be adding more lanes, but other things. Help me with what other ITS things you can do. But I want to make sure it's broad enough to incorporate those. It's not just about adding new lanes.
I believe that's the intent of the change. Yeah, that it felt too restrictive having that such as in there. Yes. So any other comments on this, or are we okay moving forward? Jana?
I want to make sure that we do consider adding some new lanes.
Yes.
In all of this discussion.
Taking it out of the charter does not mean it's out of the discussion. It just means that the discussion has room for that and other things.
And I don't want us to get too bogged in the language piece. I mean,
Right.
I think it's pretty clear as the purpose of the charter is evaluating options to implement value pricing to reduce congestion on I-5 and 205 in
Correct.
Portland.
Right.
And again, you know, in the conversations around financing and all that, I think we can save that for another forum. But yeah, I personally want to leave all options on the table right now. To see what it is that we can come up again that makes pragmatic solutions for, you know, the business community, the people driving vehicles, as well as all the other users of the system.
Okay, so I believe we've put that one to bed unless people have concern. Paul?
Yeah, if the only change on that bullet is taking the such as, I'm fine with that. But I thought that to Ms. Hagerbaumer's comment, if I pronounce your name right, I hope we didn't slaughter it. But the bullet above, I think, addresses hers, which is managing congestion. I think that ITS things would fit that.
Right. I don't think she was proposing that it be included. She just wanted to make sure it wasn't precluded.
Right.
Yes. Yes, Ann.
So Penny, could you actually read what you think you heard us say?
Yes. What I think I heard you say was value pricing used as a means to finance the construction of roadway infrastructure that will improve the efficient movement of goods and people. So that was the last substantive change that I had to discuss under the charter. Any other thoughts, or are we close? Paul?
I'm sorry, I thought that I misunderstood. I thought the change was just to strike such as, so I was concerned about taking the word bottlenecks out of that.
If you feel that it needs to be said again, I don't see any reason to take it out. It's in the title. I was just trying to reduce duplication, but if you feel it needs to be in the sentence, it doesn't matter. It's not a substantive change. So, can you live with it as it's struck, or do you need it in?
It's in the title. I just think that, again, I think it might be misperceived.
Well, how about if we just leave it in, and we'll just be accused of being a little duplicative? Doesn't change anything. Okay, we'll leave that in. All right. Anything else on the charter? Any other issues? Are we ready to call this cooked? Ready to put this one in the books as completed? We will want you all to sign it, but we do need to make a couple of these changes, so I think we will orchestrate the signing either electronically, or we will bring clean copy to the next meeting for the signature. But I am going to assume, unless I hear any objections right now, I'm going to assume there's consensus around the table that this, as with these changes that we discussed today, this is the charter that you're all willing to sign on to. Any objections to that? Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Always nice to get something completed. With that, I think we are going to move on now to our more technical parts of the agenda. No, first, well, we're going to talk about a really important piece. I forgot about Ann. How could I forget about my colleague, right? Ann would like to, Ann with Enviro Issues, Ann Presentine, would like to talk with you a bit. Did I go too far? Sorry. Well, that's your slide. That's a slide that I have. I'm sorry. I guess I was supposed to address this slide. I forgot. A lot of people have asked a little bit about the value pricing timeline and how the work of the Policy Advisory Committee fits into the whole process. And so this chart is just a way to describe that the Policy Advisory Committee is really just a first step in the recommendations to the OTC to submit the request for approval from FHWA for value pricing is really, this is all initial work. Once there is a lot more to be done once the approval comes back from FHWA. As you can see, the timeline spreads all the way out to 2021 because there is, as I forget who mentioned it, I think it was Ann who mentioned that there will be a National Environmental Policy Act process that there will have to be more analysis done and then an implementation plan done. So we really are very early in this process. So I'm just wanting to make sure that people don't think that once the PAC's work is done and the OTC seeks FHWA approval that suddenly the next day tolling is implemented, because there's a lot more to be done after that. So this is a pretty long, thoughtful process that will happen. Okay, with that, let me move on to Ann Presentine from Enviro Issues, who is going to speak with you about public engagement.
Hello, nice to be here today. I am serving on the consultant team and leading the education and engagement process with my colleagues. And today my goals are to discuss our goals for communications for this process, tactics to reach our goals, and then also our schedule for the next 7 months. Based on the slide you saw previously, I'll just be talking about a pretty narrow band because there is a lot to do after this process. That way, okay. Education and engagement is an extremely important component of this project, as we've heard from many people. We recognize that many people are unfamiliar with tolled facilities in Oregon, and they're especially unfamiliar with how value pricing could help address congestion. So with that understanding, we have developed our goal for the engagement process, which is that ODOT will work with a wide diversity of stakeholders to seek and consider feedback on concepts so that the benefits and impacts from value pricing can be well understood with ample opportunity for input. At the end of the process, stakeholders can say that the process was open, transparent, and inclusive. Our objectives as we go forward for the next several months are to both generate awareness and knowledge about congestion and the plans to address it, apply both in-person and online tactics to gain input and inform decision-making of this body, the OTC, and others, and then apply an open and transparent inclusive process to both foster acceptance and consent of the final outcome of this process. As we got going to start to think about the different activities that we would be due to both educate and engage the public, we did several things. We first researched past successes throughout the country in congestion pricing and tolling to understand what worked there in terms of educating the public. We also reviewed demographics in the region, and you saw some of the results of that analysis last time. We've identified stakeholders and audiences through interviews with the PAC and community members. Some of those interviews are still ongoing as we develop our plan. And the PAC represents many of our stakeholders, so we are depending on you to reach out, and that is why hearing from you at the beginning of every meeting is really so important to this process. We've also applied our knowledge of what works in the Portland-Vancouver metro area for engagement processes, and just so that we can receive constructive input. And again, we just know that these concepts are unfamiliar, so throughout every activity, education is going to be a huge component. The tactics that we're proposing really fall into a couple of categories. One is to share information and gather input. And the other is to engage in two-way dialogue where we have face-to-face conversations with folks. Under the sharing information and gathering input, there's some tactics up there, but that includes things like having a fact sheet, and of which you have one in your packet today, having a web page, providing information on social media. We'll be doing an online open house, an online survey, and then also having email and comment forms. In our two-way dialogue, this PAC is a very, very important component of encouraging two-way dialogue with all of the stakeholders and affected parties. But we're also interviewing stakeholders, and we're going to be doing presentations to community groups with standing meetings who invite us. And then we'll be hosting small group discussions, open houses, and listening sessions as we go. The potential effects to Title VI and EJ populations is of great concern to ODOT, and ODOT's identified several categories of potential impacts from tolling to Title VI and EJ populations. They include cost and travel time impacts, neighborhood traffic impacts, environmental impacts, and economic impacts. So we have an intentional focus of reaching out to these communities and asking for their input in ways that are convenient to them. And just so we're clear, environmental justice means identifying and addressing disproportionately high and adverse effects of the agency's programs, policies, activities on minorities and low-income populations. And we want to understand who will be affected, either positively or negatively, and to what extent. So we have a table up here that identifies our primary methods of reaching these populations, which includes stakeholder interviews, community conversations or briefings to standing groups, and if they're standing meetings, hosting discussion groups, and then open houses, listening sessions, and online engagement. Everyone is welcome to attend or participate in any of the public events, but these are the ones that we think will be most, that were the easiest for these populations to attend or participate in. And here's our schedule you've seen before. Currently, we're planning and scheduling our outreach of meetings and events, and ODOT is committed to hearing input from both sides of the river, and we'll be doing some outreach in Southwest Washington. Throughout, we'll be doing briefings and presentations. We have the project email, voicemail, and the PAC email and PAC testimony that you heard. In January, we're going to hold discussion groups with historically underrepresented populations and others affected by value pricing, and then we'll also be doing 3 open houses. We're in the planning stages of those right now in terms of dates and locations, but we hope to announce them before the holidays. And really, in January, our purpose is to educate the public on the project and the initial range of concepts to address the charge from the legislature, consult with and hear from the broader public on the concepts and understand needs, interests, concerns, and opportunities with value pricing, and ensure the public knows how to stay informed and involved. In March, we'll have revised concepts, and we'll go back out to the public with a similar process, and we'll bring those results back to you in May as you consider your recommendations. And OTC, as we understand, is likely to have their own hearings as they move ahead. So as we refine our plans, we're looking for your suggestions on local events, standing community meetings that might provide an opportunity to share information and gather feedback. And I'll take any questions. Go ahead.
Are you working with Metro in relationship to their community-based organizations? I sat on the Equity Advisory Committee there, and they have cataloged a number of community-based organizations and would be a good resource in relationship to those briefings.
Thank you. We'll go ahead and do that.
Thanks. 3 questions, I guess. So have you thought about or identified any trusted messengers on that EJ outreach in terms of, sort of to Pam's point, some intermediaries that already are working with those working with those populations?
We understand that that is absolutely a best practice, and we are working to identify those. So any suggestions you have, we would welcome.
Great. And then materials-wise, what languages are you translating materials into?
Spanish, Russian, and Chinese. We're still looking to see which of Mandarin versus Cantonese would be the best, but we are really looking throughout, and we'll be looking for that advice from some of those trusted leaders in the communities.
Good. And then one additional group is the Transportation Justice Alliance. That would be a good additional outreach.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to note that when I spoke with almost all of you, I think before we started, I asked you questions about, who to reach out to and so forth. And if you gave me input, I've already provided it to Ann, so she has that already. Any other questions or comments for Ann? Yes, go ahead, Brandon.
Thanks, Penny. I know we're on kind of a tight timeline on this, and this looks great. And I don't want to contribute to people's inboxes being filled up, but I just know from our perspective, we'd like to know if it's maybe every 2 weeks, if we could know who you're out, who you're talking to, who those folks are. I don't know if other committee members are interested in that, but I know City of Portland would be.
Are you suggesting in between the meetings or at the meetings? We are planning on bringing information back to each meeting on what we have been doing. For
and our next meeting is scheduled for the end of February?
Right.
Right. So I would probably be interested in what kind of outreach activities you're doing in between now and then.
Some status reports?
Yeah.
I think we can do that.
Great. Thanks.
Anyone else?
Or are there others interested in the same request that Brendan has made?
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Ann. Paul, go ahead.
So one question, I'm just curious how many, after we have all that compiled and is completed, looks March, April, If we've done all that, how many meetings do we have after that scheduled? Just that, I see maybe one. I'm not sure how the time, I'm going vertically up and down. Does that relate to the top and the bottom there?
You mean the PAC? The PAC has meetings in April, May, and June.
April, May, and June. Okay, so we have 2 meetings, May and June. All right.
Yeah, well, yes.
To review all that input.
Right, and you'll be getting it starting in February. I mean, you'll be getting it throughout.
Right.
Right, yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Ann. I appreciate it. And we are going to keep moving smartly along. Kirsten is back, Kirsten Pennington, the consultant team project manager, to pick up from where we last left the discussion on performance measures from the last PAC meeting.
Great, thank you, Penny, and good morning, everybody. We are talking about concept evaluation and performance measures, and the objective of this agenda item is to finalize the performance measures so that the project team can move forward to develop additional information that will help inform PAC recommendations. And so over the next, I think I have 45 minutes, we'll first cover a brief reminder about the PAC process and an overview of the evaluation process. We'll talk about how the project team took your comments from the last PAC meeting and incorporated that into draft Tech Memo 1, which is in your packet, and that's relating to performance measures. And we'll also have time for discussion of performance measures. And then I'll close with a brief tee up for the next presentation, which is about initial concepts for analysis. So I think I'll spend about 5 minutes of presentation. There's half an hour allocated for PAC discussion. What's that?
25 minutes.
25 minutes, sorry. 25 minutes for PAC discussion, and then I'll close with another 5 minutes. And I'll try to keep it brief so that you all have a chance as PAC members to discuss. So Penny already covered this time frame. Again, reminding everyone that we are really in the foundational stages right now for this project, laying a common understanding of goals, what we're trying to achieve, and lining up questions that will help to develop a PAC recommendation, which is on the wall over there. So just to remind the group, the charge is to talk about the locations on I-5 and 205 best suited to implement value pricing, talking about the type of value pricing application, and then also talking about mitigations that might be paired with certain concepts going forward. This time frame is, if you think back to the slide we just showed, this is just that first piece of the time frame for what would ultimately be leading up to implementing a value pricing concept. And there are really 3 phases that are part of the PAC process. And you'll remember that we talked last time, we're driving to a PAC recommendation to the OTC in June of next year. And then the OTC will conduct hearings, they will formulate a report, and they will make a proposal to FHWA by December of 2018. We already talked about there's a lot more that comes after that. So this is just looking from now until June. There are 3 pieces of the PAC process. The first is the foundation. So that's really what we've been talking about during the first PAC meeting and during this PAC meeting. So that's outlining performance measures, and it's setting some of the parameters and defining some of the building blocks for helping all of us to better understand some of the trade-offs and information that we'll need, and that you want staff and the consultant team to provide you
for additional analysis so that we can work toward a recommendation. So that's the first piece. The second phase is evaluation. So as we talked about, as Ann just covered, we'll bring some information back to you, both technical analysis and public outreach at PAC 3 for you all to consider. We'll take a look at that. We'll make some changes to the types of concepts that might be looked at, and then we'll do another round of technical analysis and public outreach before PAC 4. So that's really the evaluation piece. And then the last two PAC meetings will be working toward refining a recommendation by the June timeframe. So let's transition to talking about the objectives and performance measures. And you have this in your packet. I think I will refer to the redlined version that's in your packet instead of what will be up on the screen. You have both, though it should be consistent, but the version in your packet shows the changes that were made since last time. So at our last meeting, we talked about the purpose of objectives and performance measures and talked about how these are really intended to represent the spectrum of community and stakeholder values that are important for understanding the potential impacts of any value pricing concept. We also talked about how they're a tool to help guide a recommendation. It's not, these performance measures aren't the recommendation makers themselves. So the people in this room will be developing the recommendation, not any kind of spreadsheet or that kind of thing. It's just to be used as a tool. Why do we have goals and why do we have objectives and performance measures? We want to guide concept development, and we want to be able to compare and contrast the different pros and cons of different concepts. So that is a really important piece for all of us to be on the same page about, is that a lot of the analysis that we'll be doing over the coming months is intended to show the difference between options. So it's really to be used for comparison purposes to understand which concepts best meet the values of stakeholders in the community. Our technical analysis will happen in 2 rounds. So during the first round, we're developing these performance measures. We have an initial set of concepts that my colleague David will talk about in just a moment. And those are not intended as proposals, but they're intended to be a foundation for conducting public outreach and technical analysis, and those will be refined as we move through the process. So during round 1, we'll learn more about these options, and we'll learn about traffic, we'll learn about diversion, equity, community impacts, revenue and cost, and public input. So you'll receive some level of that kind of information at your next PAC meeting. After PAC 3, our team will take what we hear back from you and refine the concepts and look into those issues plus more based on what we hear. We are working to develop the measures with a multi-agency, to evaluate the measures with a multi-agency team that involves ODOT, Metro, and Southwest Washington RTC staff. So we've been working hard with them to make sure that the measures we're saying we can measure, we actually can measure. And that brings me to what we heard from you all at the last meeting. So I'll refer to the tech memo, and I'm looking at table 3-1, which starts on page 5 of your memo. And I will note that you see 2 types of red line changes in this document. The first is related to what we heard from you at PAC 1. And the second is any technical changes that we made based on further discussion with our modeling group, either to simplify or clarify language around, around some of the measures. It was not intended to change the intent at all, but simply to technical clarifications. So those are the types of changes you will see in the memo. So I'll quickly run through the PAC comments we heard, and then we'll have time for discussion. So first of all, last meeting we heard that from several folks that safety should have a higher profile and be considered. So you'll see on page 5 that we added that into the list of things to take a look at. We also heard from PAC folks that we need to understand how we'll be able to accommodate population and employment in the future. And the project team will be doing that. We will be looking at forecasts, employment, population, traffic forecasts for year 2027. And the reason we picked that year is because that's consistent with the regional transportation plan. So we wanted to make sure that our planning is apples to apples. We also heard that the potential for racial profiling during implementation should be considered. So the project team has captured that comment, and as the PAC talks about mitigations as we get into PAC 4, PAC 5, this will be a topic that I'm sure will come up again, and the PAC will want to consider how it's treated in terms of the recommendation. The team was asked to consider particulates and toxins in addition to, I think we had emissions, so we've added that in to the table. That's on page 6.
Excuse me.
Yes.
If I may.
Yes.
I was the one that requested this
Yes.
change, and actually the word was toxics, not
Sorry.
toxins.
Yes.
And while the comment includes that, the actual proposed response does not. I would actually prefer the whole reference to just say air pollution, to consider vehicle emissions. But if we're going to be specific, and the original ones just specifically said greenhouse gas emissions, if we're going to be specific, I believe that toxics needs to be listed as an included measure for measurement, particularly things like nitric oxides and other oxides, nitrous oxides. One of the reasons why I think that's important is because, as I learned in the whole CMAQ discussion that we had earlier this year, those air toxics are actually the types of pollutants in our region that this region is more likely to violate federal air quality standards with than any other. So it needs to be something that we measure.
Does the group agree with that?
Yeah, any concerns with that?
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks. So we'll make those changes as we move forward. Just the final comment that we heard at the last meeting was the interest in considering geographic impacts, and we understand that that's very important to many of the PAC members and many stakeholders and members of the public. And the team is committed to providing this information as possible for many of the performance measures. We did talk with our modeling team, and that's something that they're able to assess for many of the performance measures. So we will do that as a project team to the best of our ability. So I think at this point, it's best to transition to additional discussion and questions. Yes.
I have a question.
Oh, yes.
Could you go back to the racial profiling comment and explain to me whether or not, will that be flagged as we move forward in these discussions? Will it be a reminder for us to come back to that issue as we look at the recommendations? Is that how we're going to be handling it?
Yes, that was what I intended to say, so apologies if that
No, I
didn't
just
come
wanted
out
to make
clearly.
sure that I understood. Thank you.
Okay, so I have I have Brandon, Ann, Park, and then Chris. No, that's not Chris. Can you turn it? Sorry. Marie, thank you.
Thank you, and appreciate having safety impacts in the factors for consideration for traffic operations on I-5 and I-205. One suggestion or request, as I mentioned in our last meeting, Portland, the city of Portland is very concerned about diversion within the city, and would it be all right if we included safety impacts under the diversion of traffic as a performance measure?
And I think if that's the will of the group, we can take that back to our team and see what we can do.
I would support that. I think it has to be. Diversion in the neighborhood roads is would have a huge safety factor impact.
And just in response to that, Kirsten, there's
Yes.
Under community or impacts to community and economy and environment, there's a section already that identifies diversion impacts on non-tolled facilities, and that's an area that might be an easy one to add
yes.
to this concern.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you. Kirsten, is the considered geographic impacts considered that second bullet under equity impacts? Is that where you're putting that?
So this particular comment lives in multiple criteria or under multiple areas. So the thinking was that the team would look at the geographic split for different, anything that we can. So it would apply to more than one category.
Sure, but are you looking at the key origin and destination pairs? Is that one of the areas that you're looking at?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Bart.
I have two questions regarding the performance measures. Regarding the throughput on I-5 and I-205 during peak hour, that's not plural. We do look at the duration in the next box, but that means we totally ignore the shoulders within the peak. And since in some pricing schemes they might be different, is that something we really want to not look at? Mm-hmm. And I'm not a research person. If somebody tells me what's here is enough, I can live with that. But I thought it would be peak hours mm-hmm. that we would look at.
So if that is of interest to the PAC, we can take that back to our project team.
Okay.
Is that?
And the second question, third from the bottom on the performance measures, mode share, HOVs included. I don't see anywhere carpooling and vanpooling. Can I assume it's in that HOV category and that we'd look at the potential impacts of those?
Yes, I don't want to say quite the wrong thing in terms of what the model can assess, but we did talk about that being able to be included. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Marie.
On the previous slide, there was the second point where we were looking ahead to the year 2027. The next one, there we go.
Sorry.
There. Need to understand how we'll accommodate population and employment in the future. I think somewhere in here we need to also talk about all the changes that are coming in transportation technology. We're on the cusp of some major changes with the deployment of autonomous vehicles, and a lot of scientists say that we're about 15 to 20 years out before much of the fleet is autonomous, but I think that we really need to look at how these vehicles are going to be used and how they're going to be used differently than cars today.
Thank you.
Curtis?
Thank you. If I could draw your attention to the impacts on community, economy, and environment, and I apologize I didn't submit this previously, but I missed our first meeting. We do have an objective of evaluate impacts to freight movement and access to industrial areas and job centers, which is terrific, but under the performance measures, that's not really captured. And so I'm wondering about regional freight movement inside the metro area as a performance measure.
How do others feel about that?
I think that's an important aspect.
We show it as an objective, and yet we don't measure it, so we wouldn't know if we were having the desired impacts in our modeling.
Pam, are you up specifically on that?
On this issue, yes.
Okay.
I would support that, and I think it's very important from the private sector viewpoint to make sure we are addressing that as well. So thank you, Curtis, for bringing that up.
Ryan.
Thank you. And I think this gets to something that Curtis is saying and something that Brendan was saying in terms of the vehicle trips and the type of trips. So as we talk about diversion, I noticed that we crossed out trip length distribution, and we moved that into the I-5 and 205, but I'm interested in making sure that we understand that beyond I-5 and 205, particularly as it relates to diversion, in terms of what type of a trip are we diverting, because I think that's important to understand that if we're diverting long-range trips onto these facilities, that has a different impact in my mind than it does if I'm diverting a local trip back onto the local system. So I'm still not convinced that this totally gets to that. So I just want to make sure that the trip length, the type of trip piece is better reflected.
I see nods around the room for that.
Yep.
So.
Okay.
Tony.
Thank you. In the first meeting, I'm speaking on the equity impacts factors for consideration in the first objective, evaluate benefits and burdens. And in the first meeting, what I articulated and would be the desired objective here is not to simply evaluate the benefits and burdens, but to affirmatively create benefits to those communities from this system. And there's a big difference there in terms of if we end up with a process that can simply say, well, we evaluated the benefits and burdens, okay, that's not sufficient. The goal, I believe, is to, from an equity perspective, and I think we're hampered by the fact that we don't know a lot about who is using the system in terms of race and income demographics. Looking at the maps that were presented in the first meeting, we get some sense of it, but we don't have it very detailed. So I think part of that is caught up in understanding the who, and then if in fact those communities are disproportionately impacted, then having the affirmative benefits come out of that process.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Chris. Microphone, please.
On the issue of the impacts to community, economy, and environment, I'm kind of curious why you chose to bundle those all together and not break them out. But that's my bigger question here is, it looks like this evaluation is a compared to status quo, correct?
It's intended to be showing the differences among options. So while there will be a baseline included, it's really to show A compared to B, compared to C, compared to D.
So I would suggest that we have a situation where we could have things stay as they are and things could get more congested, and we have the situation that we currently have today, which is problematic. We're suggesting that we need to solve that issue. One way to do that is with congestion pricing, and I see you're saying that you're just looking at differences between different congestion pricing options, but I think that showing what the status quo is would be really helpful, as well as we've heard from some folks that, well, why don't you just build enough capacity to deal with the projected amount of traffic? I think we should be showing what impacts would that have on community and environment and so on, so that people are actually looking at, here's the problem that we have, here's one way to solve it, here's another way to solve it. What would those impacts be, the differences be between those ways of solving it, so that people could actually see, wow, if we were to add that many lane miles in this region, do you know how much that would cost us as the public? So, because people are not getting that perspective in this type of performance evaluation.
Thanks, Chris. And just a reminder to put your card down as you're talking, so people know who's talking to them. Paul.
Yes, early on, the mayor had brought up a point, and I heard your response, but really maybe like to build on that, on this conversation a little bit. I think it ought to be better displayed, getting back to the geographic piece. I like what it says there, performance measures will be provided and or displayed sub-regionally where possible. But if this somewhere in the performance measures, I think it needs to be more prominent.
Okay.
And more definitive as to what the sub-regions might be.
Okay. And is there agreement on that around the table?
Does anybody have any problems with that? Okay.
So we can bring that back at our next meeting.
Okay. Ann?
Thank you. Under public input,
yes.
The objective, determine public understanding. Determine might be a problem. How about increase public understanding or consider public understanding instead of determine?
Thanks, Ann. That was one of the comments in your,
Yes, thank you.
Yep. Thanks for bringing that up. And I do have comments from TriMet that I'm going to bring up when I get through with everybody's at the table. Okay. Craig?
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to weigh in on what Ms. Hagerbaumer said about performance measures. Typically, performance measures are measured as improvement against a baseline. So the question is, when you're looking at, when it says vehicle and person throughput, compared to what? And I think people are going to ask that question. So if the purpose is to compare different options against each other, somewhere that needs to be defined. Or if there is a baseline that we're going to use for some of the performance measures, then that needs to be defined so people understand what we're measuring against.
Excellent, and I think I wasn't clear earlier that we will have a baseline that will be included as part of the analysis, so apologies for not being super clear about that.
And the baseline is a non-tolled.
Correct.
Yeah, basically a no-build option is the baseline?
It's a anticipated build option, but a no-build from a tolled perspective.
Yeah, and we'll actually hear a little bit more about that in the next agenda item. Yeah.
And Garrett?
Yeah, I just wanted to offer my support for Tony DeFalco's comment about the performance measure regarding equity impacts, being that we would measure success here by our ability to affirmatively create benefits within those EJ communities. So I just wanted to +1 that.
Okay.
And Penny, I just heard you say you're going to bring up some of Neil McFarland's comments, so I'll hold my support for some changes that he's recommended as well.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and that's exactly where I was going to go. So I think we gave you this letter. He had a request under transit factors for consideration in the objectives. He had a request to amend the language to say, evaluate impacts to transit service resulting from changes in traffic operations. That, yeah, seems reasonable to folks. And then under, let me see, the other one that he had was, he noted that it will be important to provide transit operators with sufficiently granular information about travel patterns, including origins and destinations, as well as traffic performance in and through the corridors to inform transit network design and evaluation. So I don't know exactly how that factors into that, but I think that's an important point. And then the other one that he noted isn't really specific to the document, but his note was that it will be imperative to establish committee and public expectations up front for what can be accomplished during this process versus what work will need to be accomplished in later phases. So I think that goes back to that timeline showing that some things will happen now with the PAC and this analysis, and then other things will occur further on into the longer process. Right. Yeah. So unless I missed something, you all have that letter. Unless I missed something, I think those are the key things from TriMet. Tony, are you back up?
Yeah, thanks. So just one of the comments I heard earlier that I thought was good was the discussion around the nature of the transportation system improvements that may be funded by such revenues as this. And so, for example, active transportation. And I'm wondering, I don't see it in here anywhere. I see the transit piece in the Neil's point made me think about it. Is that captured somewhere else? You know, in terms of evaluating non-transit system transportation improvements that would come about, we would be able to evaluate the benefits of those as from the system. Am I?
Yeah, may I?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, we would run into constitutional issues with that because taxes and fees paid by motorists have to then be reinvested into the highway system. Yeah.
And adjacent systems.
I mean, it's all in the definition, but not. You'd
I didn't hear us exclude that in the charter, or is that I heard us keep that on the table for discussion.
Well, it would violate the Constitution.
I would offer up.
Yeah.
Jenna, you want to take that?
Well, I think the point is that transit is funded differently. What Marie's speaking to is the fact that road user taxes have to go back into the highway fund. So we need to be very clear in this, and we can't mix the two.
Okay.
We can address those other issues, but not from a funding perspective.
Marianne, are you up on this or something else? Something else, okay. All right. So did you want to close on that?
Just that I would offer up that some of the issues could be captured in mitigations. So part of the recommendation from this committee will be to not only look at the type of value pricing and location, but there will be recommendations from this group on mitigation. So some of the concerns that are expressed by the group could be captured in those mitigation recommendations.
Garrick, are you up on this or something different?
Yes, just to clarify, does active transportation cover bike ped?
Yeah, absolutely, and falls squarely within the constitutional restrictions in Oregon regarding the expenditure of highway trust fund dollars. Any expenditure on a sidewalk, bike lane, or transit station improvement inside of the road right-of-way qualifies for highway trust fund expenditure. It forms the basis of the City of Portland's general transportation revenues. So I'd want to again stand up in support of what Tony is asking for, is some treatment of active transportation benefits that we might measure as a result of this effort. Revenue raised through this program can be spent on additional modes of transportation, such as biking, walking, and those transit capital improvements, as long as they are inside of the road right-of-way.
Eileen, and then Marion.
Just a point of clarification on the public input, which I think is extremely important. I think we have to actually determine what the public input is before we consider it. So maybe using both words would be more efficient.
So previously we had talked about increasing, yeah.
I think it's a bit of semantics, but maybe it's understand and then consider. Maybe understand and consider would, yeah, okay. Marion, and then it looks like Paul, and then Tony.
I just wanted to go back to Curtis's suggestion about including a measure around regional freight movement and clarify that that should include not only freight movement that begins or ends within the region, but also capturing the impacts for throughput freight that comes from other areas of the state and beyond.
So I feel like I'm seeing head nods on that around the table. Okay.
Okay, we are getting close on time and we're getting close on cards. So let me go to Paul and then Tony.
So getting back to this constitutionality question that Marie raised, I think it's valid, and but I also understand what Garrick was saying and Mr. DeFalco, and that is, I think there's a statutory, there's a constitutional, and actually a scope of work issue. And is this kind of outside the scope, in reality, of the work we've been assigned to do? Statutorily, I think there's a small percentage that can be used, and that's spelled out, and then how that interfaces with the constitutionality piece. But I think we need to get some clarity on what that is, because if people perceive, and again, and we're in the public realm, if people perceive that monies are being steered a certain way, from their road tax dollars, which I think people have a clear understanding that what those are to be used for. That might create some confusion. So putting some sideboards on what those are might help define that a little bit better.
Can I help try to answer?
Who said that?
Ryan.
Yeah. Yes, go ahead, Ryan.
Thank you. I think we're getting a little sidetracked between constitutional restrictions on the spending versus what this group is looking at. So, for example, we will be looking at the adequacy of transit service. One of the things we may talk about as a result of this is that there may be a need for an increased level of transit service. That may be a recommendation that would come out as a mitigation. It would not necessarily need to come out as we recommend spending dedicated highway trust fund revenues on increased transit. That's not what we would be asked. We would be asked to get to the level of there's a need, and the issue about funding and how you might get there is something that we can refer back to the OTC, and we can refer back to the legislature potentially as things that we need to continue to explore further. So I hope that helps answer the question in a more definitive way, that yes, we will be looking at those things, and we will be potentially have recommendations around them, but we don't need to get to the level of how we would necessarily get to that.
Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate that. Tony, and then it looks like Phil has gone up, and then I'm going to try and wrap this up.
So I appreciated Mr. Courtwright's comments this morning about the disproportionate burdens of our transportation system, and I think one performance measure that may be able to capture that in the equity is, and I don't have it super clearly defined, but I'm just thinking about it and happy to spend more time with you all on it, is something that is able to evaluate the economic, I think there's economic impact in there, but something around the additional burden on price relative to the communities that would be low-income communities in particular impacted by tolling.
Okay. I see head nods there.
Yeah, okay.
And Phil?
I'll just tag on to what Ryan said a bit there. When we start talking about value pricing and affecting demand, I think, mode choice and access and availability, all those things are affected. So I do believe the public transportation piece of this is it needs to be part of the strategy.
Okay, so my question to you all is, you've proposed a number of changes, and we've tried to kind of get, head nodding along the way that none of these things seem, I haven't seen anybody waving any red flags that they're diametrically opposed to anything. So I think that my question to you is, and this is a little bit conceptual, but with those changes that were discussed today, assuming that they're addressed, does this seem like a good set of performance measures to help guide the work as you move forward? I mean, do these seem like they will work for you, work for your work? Anybody have any concerns that something is missing, or this isn't what you need, or anything like that? Because it feels like people seem like it's on the right track. Okay. Garrett?
I do want to return to the question of, how we will measure potential improvements in biking and walking infrastructure, and because I'm not seeing it explicitly written, I don't want to use transit as a proxy for those types of investments that could be a part of how we, improve a corridor-based approach to transportation as we, address congestion on our major highways. So I'm seeing a missing element there.
Thoughts about that?
So can we take that back to the team and get back to this group at the next meeting on that topic?
Ryan?
Well, just understanding that we are now going to go start running the model. I think I'd rather kind of try to get to answering the could we have a measure that just says the adequacy of bike ped, which is similar to the adequacy of transit, and then we'll need to do as a potential mitigation option or something. So would that be? I just want to make sure we answer the question. Is that something we're interested in understanding? If it is, then we ought to say that here so that we can start, because we're going to start modeling. We're not going to have an opportunity to come back. I want to just make sure it's answered.
So that could be nested under the transit service, or we could alter that to be transit service and bike and pedestrian, if that works for the group.
Does that seem all right with everybody? And Craig, I wanted to make sure that all your issues that you had sent in your letter have been addressed. Okay, all right, great. Okay, excellent. Thanks,
Okay.
Kirsten. I think we got there, and I think we got there right on time. I think you're going to set up our next agenda item. Am I correct?
Just really briefly, so this was showing comparisons of maybe what you might see in the future coming back. So at our last, at the last PAC meeting, Trey covered a variety of different conceptual building blocks, and David's going to come up in just a moment and talk through these. And if folks remember, the primary three that were talked about included a priced roadway, which is looking at pricing all lanes of a facility, price lane, which is in two flavors of that. So one where there's a conversion of an existing lane, and one where there is a construction of a new lane, or where there's an added lane. So David will come talk about how these building blocks will work together to inform the next step of analysis. And he'll talk about how we'll be developing bookends for analysis. So these concepts that you'll hear about are not formal proposals. Pieces of them could end up in the PAC recommendation and the OTC recommendation, but what the intent behind these bookends is to understand the range of impacts that different value pricing treatments could have when applied to I-5 and 205. So David will cover those bookends, and then how to create combinations of those bookends to create further understanding about the range of potential impacts. So that's all going to be happening between this PAC meeting and the next PAC meeting. At PAC 3, we'll know more. We'll have additional technical evaluation. We'll incorporate the comments that you had on performance measures, so we'll have a little bit more information there. We'll also have had a chance to go to the public and hear what the public has had to say. And so we'll bring that back to your next PAC, and that's where we'll really see the start of being able to potentially discard some options that might not be workable for the area. And it also might be a period where we look in at targeted segments of the different freeway facilities. And then that will go through, again, a technical evaluation and public outreach. So just to lay out what happens next in terms of concepts to lead into the following discussion.
Great, thanks. David.
Good morning. Thank you very much. My name is David Ungema, and I know that many of you had heard from my colleague Trey Baker last meeting, and certainly he walked through quite a number of the value pricing concepts that have been applied in communities around North America. I would like to say that I know that many of you have had additional questions about how those have been applied. I'd be happy to address those questions after the PAC. I'll stick here as long as you're willing to be here and ask questions. So be delighted to address any of those that you may have had as a result. So as Kirsten had queued up, we're going to be talking a little bit about some of the initial concepts for value pricing consideration within the I-5 and 205 corridors. And she also mentioned that these are not proposals, and I really want to underscore that. What will a proposal look like? It's one that's going to include not only the general concept, but also specific projects and policies. And you're not going to hear about projects or policies today, because that's not where we're at yet in this process. We're at the very beginning of understanding as to what these concepts, as applied, would have for potential benefits as well as detriments for the regional system, and specifically for the two corridors that are under evaluation. As we start getting through concepts and understanding where some of those benefits are likely to be emphasized and where their detriments need to be resolved, then we can start talking about specific projects, how those would be applied in the field. what would be the impact upon individual travelers in those communities or corridors, as well as those who reside and work in those communities that are adjacent to those corridors as well. Those are subsequent levels of analysis. What we're trying to do at the very beginning here is to give ourselves a baseline to work from, not only from a comparison to a scenario where there are no tolls being applied to the two corridors, but also in terms of where we're going to go in terms of the evaluation of that and the development of specific projects and policies that would enable those concepts. So, as Kirsten had mentioned, there are primarily three general categories of concepts that are under evaluation. The first is tolling all of the lanes of the highway. The second is converting one of the general purpose lanes and tolling that. And then finally, constructing a brand new lane and tolling that. And we'll talk about those and what those mean in terms of how those concepts will be applied in a moment. Of course, in order to understand the effectiveness of these three concepts, what we also need to have is an understanding as to what the baseline of what we're comparing against would look like. So at the beginning, one of the concepts that's being put through the regional model is an understanding of the baseline in the year 2027. And that includes all of the population and employment growth that's projected for the region as well, so that we get an understanding as to what it would look like in the year 2027 with these types of potential concepts being applied. Within this would include projects that are already identified within the regional transportation plan that have been approved and would be funded for construction. And so as a result, those projects are a part of all of the various concepts being applied. So we have a common base of understanding. What's different between the baseline versus the others is the implementation of tolls. In this scenario, in the baseline scenario, there are no tolls on either I-5 or I-205. So the very first one, shall we say the more comprehensive concept as applied would be to price the entirety of all lanes of travel across that roadway facility. So that would mean for every lane of travel on I-5 or every lane of travel on I-205, you would be subject to the payment of a toll, and the anticipation is you would have the benefits of higher levels of travel time reliability and travel time benefits in exchange for the payment of that toll. As you can see on the slide up here, there are a few facilities that have already been implemented around the country that involve all lanes being tolled. One of the members of the public who gave comment at the very beginning of this session highlighted some of those. They are primarily facilities that have been constructed for the purpose of building a brand new facility and using tolls as a way of paying back bonds for the construction. But that's not the only application where that occurs. On the SR 520 bridge, for example, in Seattle, there was the implementation of variable pricing on an pre-existing corridor in order to manage traffic demand as well as to generate revenue for the construction of a new bridge. These sort of scenarios are relatively few and far between, even though the potential benefits for them are pretty significant. One of the other members of the public who spoke at the very beginning of this session indicated that value pricing is at its core an economics equation, and it is trying to provide some balance between supply and demand through the use of pricing, just like we would for any other consumer good or even public utility for that matter. We have a very limited amount of supply in our facilities, and pricing through the motor fuel tax and vehicle registration is a poor proxy for use. Value pricing across all lanes of travel would provide for an ability to create balance between that price that someone would pay, hence bringing some balance to demand as well as to supply. And so the benefits would be accrued to all the users of that facility. Every user of the facility would be subject to the potential benefits of travel time reliability, greater levels of efficiency, because all are part of the program for being subject to those benefits. A couple of the other elements that you're going to see carry through for all of the strategies is the concept of throughput. So if you happen to have some familiarity with traffic engineering, you might know about the backward bending curve. And the backward bending curve is this dot map that shows the relationship between speeds and the amount of volume that you can carry through in any given point of a highway lane facility. As was mentioned by someone earlier, a typical highway lane carries 1,800 to 2,000 vehicles per hour per lane. That means if you were to just look at a lane, one point in time, you could measure up to 2,000 vehicles crossing that point. But when we start getting into saturated conditions, when traffic congestion gets really, really bad, we're not actually pushing through 2,000 vehicles per hour. We're only pushing a fraction of that potentially only as much as 1,000 people per hour, vehicles per hour through that lane. And that creates a problem. Penny had started us right at the very beginning of this meeting by saying if, in the case of an emergency, we should exit the doors that are around us. We know these doors are easily capable of carrying us and allowing us to enter and exit this room. Why? Because we all got in here and we didn't have to push anyone around to get here. In case of emergency, I'm not entirely sure that that would have occurred. We might all be rushing for those doors at the same time, and all of a sudden those doors are maybe not as efficient at pushing us through. So what does that mean? Well, even in a priced roadway scenario, there may be situations where the roadway facility, even fully priced, isn't necessarily able to carry its highest level and its most efficient level. And that's one of the implementation issues that we'll look at as we start moving from the concepts to projects to policies, is understanding where are there still constraints in the system that would lend itself towards reducing the overall effectiveness of that pricing scenario. There are other implementation issues as it pertains to price lanes across for a roadway facility. Those can include public acceptance. There are issues related to what is currently available that is untold, now being subject to a potential price. That is a very real and very present issue that should be considered throughout the process, and it will be considered throughout the scope of work. Additionally, there are some issues relating to federal law. Right now, to implement price lanes across all, price roadways across all lanes of travel would require the concurrence of the U.S. Secretary of Transportation. So she currently would need to sign off on this proposal if it was to be implemented on I-5 and I-205 under the context of what's called the Value Pricing Pilot Program. And that's where often the phrase value pricing comes from, is from the name of that program that was implemented in the 1990s. Finally, when we're talking about price roadways, all lanes of travel, there is an impact potentially on diversion. Since the entrance to that facility and exit of that facility is subject to price, regardless as to how you're using that facility, then there is the potential for diversion to either other routes or, in a very positive context, to diversion to other modes of travel. So understanding that through this process is part of the intent. So that's price roadways. Let's move now over into price lanes. What's the difference between those? Well, instead of being subject to all lanes of travel being subject to the toll, in a price lane scenario, only one lane of travel is subject to a toll, or potentially it could be two lanes. There are variations as we start moving from concept to project. But in the context of the first assessment and understanding, we're talking about this in the sense of one lane of travel. There are two variations within the concepts being evaluated. The first is converting a general purpose lane, so not changing the overall laneage on either of the two corridors. The second is to construct a new lane of travel. There are some differences amongst these. This has been a very typically applied a system of value pricing in the United States in particular. So there are over 45 operational priced lane facilities in the United States. They're called express lanes in most communities, and certain communities are called managed lanes. If you see either of those two terms, that's what this is talking about. But even amongst all those 45 different express lanes and managed lanes, there are significant variations in how those have been applied both as projects and as policies. And so as a result, it's often a word of caution about comparing one facility to the other without understanding its context. It's like airports. Every airport has essentially the same function, to get you onto a plane that will get you to another airport. But if you travel as much as I do, every airport looks completely different from one another, and they have different, understandings of their functionality and level of comfort. It's much the same with express lanes. Some are going to be highly designed for your comfort, and others are not. So just a word of caution about comparing them. In terms of the benefits, unlike in a priced roadway scenario, the priced express lane users are the ones who are going to primarily benefit from the travel time, reliability, and efficiency benefits of value pricing. General purpose lane users may have a limited level of benefit from those facilities, or there may even be scenarios when that there's either no impact or even potentially a slightly worsened impact. It all depends on how that concept is applied as a project and as a policy. But for those who are in the express lane, they are utilizing higher levels of, or enjoying higher levels of travel time reliability, higher levels of throughput. And when you start looking at the overall footprint of the freeway facility, you're getting more and more vehicles through, so that backward bending curve is no longer as applicable. You are able to encourage greater levels of vehicle throughput and also person throughput if you are encouraging the use of buses and carpools in that facility. So what are some of the implementation issues of price lanes? Well, certainly when you're converting one general purpose lane into an express lane, there may be the situation where conditions worsen in the general purpose lanes. And that certainly could occur at the peak shoulders, what we call the peak shoulders. That means the time right before the peak hour versus and the times immediately after the peak hour. There are additional issues related to federal approval and public acceptance, much the same as it would be with a priced roadway when converting a general purpose lane. There are also issues of lane continuity. You know, a good example is on I-5. When you start, when you're heading northbound, as you start approaching 405 by the south of downtown Portland, if you're in the left lane of travel, if you were to not exit that lane of travel, you'd be exiting at City Center. You wouldn't be continuing on I-5. So there are considerations as to how, what a conversion would look like and how it's applied in the field. One other element that's worth noting is that Oregon law currently has some restrictions in terms of truck use, in terms of what lanes they can utilize. So when we're talking about a price lane, if we want trucks and freight to be able to benefit from travel time reliability and efficiency uses of that lane, there may have to be an examination as to what the requirements are for those trucks and be able to use that left lane. By comparison, building a brand new lane and pricing that is a different scenario. First, you're increasing capacity, so we don't anticipate problems with general purpose lane uses. So in the situations where new lanes of travel have been created and priced, there are also consequent benefits to the general purpose lane users as well, even those who don't pay a toll, based upon the addition of capacity in that corridor. There are also, it's the only scenario where it can be built by right under federal law, so you don't need the explicit signature of the U.S. Secretary of Transportation in order to implement that type of concept. One element that's worth considering, though, in terms of a newly constructed price lane is, of course, the cost of providing that newly constructed price lane. It's not going to be easy in all areas, and it certainly could be very, very costly in certain areas. So that's one consideration with that application. So we're going to conclude here with what are the concepts being applied? How are we looking at this through different modeling exercises, and how are we looking at it in terms of other types of feasibility assessment that go well beyond just simply modeling findings? The first is to look at all four of those concepts: baseline, priced roadways, converted price lane, and added price lane, as concepts to be applied across the entirety of both corridors. And so those are the first four scenarios that you see up here. But as Kirsten had mentioned as well, we are also looking at it from a combination aspect. We already understand that the conditions on I-205 are very different from the conditions on I-5. That's not only just the physical environment in which they're located, but it's also the travel markets. It's also the communities in which they reside. And so some initial ideas in terms of what the concept combinations would be examined include looking at combinations of perhaps a baseline condition on one corridor and then a price scenario on another. So in the first on the lower left, you can see it is looking at baseline on I-5 and then combining that with constructing and pricing a new lane on I-205. The second combination is looking at pricing the entirety of I-5, but then not doing any additional level of improvement beyond the baseline on I-205. The third scenario on that bottom combination is the conversion of a general purpose lane on I-5, and then the priced roadway scenario on I-205. And then finally, the last scenario is the conversion of a general purpose lane on I-5, and then coupling that with the provision of new capacity of sub-priced lane on I-205. These are some of the initial combinations that we would look at in terms of these concepts. And certainly, by the time we come back to PAC number 3 meeting at the end of February, it's going to be examining a lot of the initial findings of these concepts as evaluated, as well as the context and conditions by which we would then start coming forward with concepts that could eventually move to projects. I believe that's where we end. So I'll leave this up because I think this might be helpful for any questions that you may have.
Yeah. Thoughts, questions? Craig.
Thank you. I've reviewed these, and I think these are a great set of scenarios for the initial concepts to be reviewed. I would suggest that this group acknowledge those and encourage ODOT to move forward in evaluating them, making clear the understanding that their evaluation should not be restricted to only those, that we should allow ODOT the flexibility and to be creative and come up with other scenarios further down the line as the evaluation makes clear which ones are clearly work, which ones don't. Maybe new concepts will arise that haven't been thought of yet as we go through the evaluation. We shouldn't restrict ODOT from being able to consider other things as well as different issues arise. But acknowledging these ones is a good place. As it says, the initial concepts fully support not only these concepts. They should be free to consider others as well.
Thank you, Craig. Other thoughts? Yeah, go ahead, Paul.
So under these scenarios you're laying out, the way it displays as though that the entire section of 205 and I-5 would be tolled. Or as I thought I read earlier in the material, the last meeting, there might be possibly of tolling segments of those interstates. So how would that be a modified version of that, or is that a different part of the analysis at a future phase?
Right, excellent point. And so I think that's where we start getting into that concept of going from concepts to projects, right? So looking at I-5, it's very easy to see that there are different segments on I-5 that lend themselves differently to the implementation of value pricing concepts. It may be very difficult around downtown Portland. It may be slightly easier on the northern or southern ends. And so what they lend themselves to in terms of segmented analysis is what you will see at the third PAC meeting. This is to give us, we call them the bookends because it really is, if you think about a bookshelf, it is, everything in between the two ends of a bookshelf and how to examine the implementation of value pricing within it. I have full anticipation that neither corridor would see the same, the recommendation of one specific concept, project, and policy across the entire length of that corridor. And so as we start moving through this process, we're going to start talking and discussing with you the various aspects of not only segments, but also how those projects would emerge within those segments. What would it look like for travelers using it? How would they access in and out of a facility if it's a priced lane? What would be the diversionary impacts, if any, upon local communities and contexts within those segments? So that's how we would start looking at emerging down the line with different strategies.
Clark.
I'd be interested in getting a list of the other examples that you noted, the 40 or 50, so we can be doing some of our own research.
Sure. So there's quite a bit of research that's available, and we certainly can compile a library and share that with the PAC through its mechanisms. Yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
To do so.
Other questions or comments or thoughts about these bookends? Marion.
Just looking at the options on the bottom, I'm noticing that for 205, it does not include converting an existing lane as an option that we're looking at. And then on the other hand, on I-5, there's no constructing a new lane, price lane. And if we're kind of looking at all the options and bookends and how they stack up, why are we leaving one of those options off the table for each of those roads?
So we are looking at both, at least in terms of the top four, concepts, and those are being applied as well. In fact, those are the ones that will move forward first in terms of the analysis. So we are looking at conversion on 205. We are looking at adding a lane on I-5 in those scenarios. In the combinations, this was, just to try to get some good comparison points between one versus another. One of the scenarios is I-5 is a much more complicated corridor to provide new capacity in. Be it, everything is resolvable through cost at one point or the other. If you have enough money, you can pretty much do anything from an engineering perspective. But that's only one of many different variables as to whether to do something or not. So it was at least our initial, belief that we would be covering that on the context of providing new capacity under the top four, but we're certainly flexible to, examine these combinations, and much to the point of Mr. Dirksen, that there would be, you know, the opportunity to look at different combinations as well.
Phil.
Thank you. And you do indicate initial concepts here. So is your expectation that you will look at, say, the priced roadway, toll all lanes condition with added capacity as another scenario?
So looking at pricing all lanes, but adding a lane within that context. So let me make sure I'm understanding. So like I-205, if it's 3 continuous lanes and through most of the corridor, sometimes 4, sometimes 2, we would be adding a lane but pricing all the lanes. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yes. I'm just thinking, this is, you know, a view of initial concepts. You indicated that you're looking at potentially many scenarios, but adding capacity, whatever that may be, there are different scenarios for adding capacity. But yes, tolling all lanes with added capacity, and tolling that added capacity as well.
So far, that specific example is not been, it would not be included in one of these combinations. So we would have to go back and talk through a little bit of that scenario of adding capacity and pricing all lanes, because we do have the added capacity but pricing only one lane, the one lane that's added, as opposed to pricing all the lanes with added capacity. That would be an interesting you know, concept to delve into as well.
And the only reason I indicate that is simply because there are parts of the system that are, you know, very constrained, you know, for whatever reason. And it's, you know, I think we all appreciate the tolling all lanes, right? But it seems as though, you know, it's not too far of a stretch to think that in addition to tolling, again, there are some system improvements that need to occur. So.
Great.
Other thoughts or comments? Yes, Chris.
So I'll go back to what I said before, which is I'm not sure, oops. I'm not sure that we as a committee or members of the general public will have the full perspective if we don't also show a scenario where, okay, the average person out there driving on a congested freeway today, if you ask them, how would you solve this problem? I think most people would say, just add more freeway capacity and don't charge me anything for that. And they don't understand what the cost of that is to society. And in fact, that means that a person who never uses the freeway would be paying the cost of that new freeway. And so if we don't show the avoided cost associated with doing congestion pricing, and we don't show the fact that if you just added new lanes and you don't price them, they'll just fill up again, as per the example of that Katy freeway in, my God, 23 lane miles wide, is that what it is?
Everything's bigger in Texas.
Wow, that would look so great in our region. I'm just saying that we're not showing the full perspective of what you would do, and people can't, it'll be harder for people to understand why this is potentially a good solution.
Thank you. Did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I'd just say that, you know, one of the challenges that I've been working on roadway pricing projects since the early 1990s. It's one of the areas that just I've been fascinated with and have, you know, dedicated my career to it. One of the challenges that I've always seen is in comparing the effects of what is an economic balancing act of value pricing versus a supply provision action of a capacity analysis, is that the capacity analysis works best as a single moment in time. You can kind of identify what the roadway requirements would be, say, in 2027, and this is the number of lanes that you would need for the peak hour in 2027. But what about 2037? There's going to be population and employment growth, I would presume, for the Portland region, and so then we would have another series of actions to have to consider 2037 and 2047. One of the aspects of pricing is that its very nature is to provide some balance between the demand side of the equation, and that's something that we miss in any type of supply side, you know, kind of conversation.
So I think that is what I'm trying to say, though, is that if you don't do the something to manage the demand, the new roadway just fills up, and I think the general population doesn't quite understand that. And so I'm just trying to get at, how do we show the benefits here? And if we don't show that just adding freeway miles doesn't work, people won't get it.
I just wanted to, if I can grab this for a sec, I just wanted to refer back to the letter from, again, from TriMet, from Neil, and he had, and you all have this, he had a couple of thoughts about the initial concepts, supportive of the approach, and I wanted to check this on the second paragraph. He said it's important that the PAC understand what, if any, changes to the I-5 and I-205 corridors are included in the baseline scenario proposed to be used in the evaluation, particularly in light of the RTP project list for the 2027 interim year. I think you addressed that in your presentation, but I just wanted to make sure everybody is clear on that, what the baseline will include. Okay, and I think that addresses all of his comments, and I think we got everything that we got written comments on. Anything else? Any other thoughts or questions about the concepts? Ryan?
And I guess I just wanted to be responsive to what Chris is bringing up. I do think it would be, we would be able to come up with something relatively easily that would be kind of a gross, like how many lanes to handle existing. We could do some calculations without going into as much detail as you're, I think, thinking, but maybe that would be informative. And so I would like us to think about how to bring that back to help inform the group. And so we will try to do some of that. I think there's sort of a general understanding is, within the folks who deal with this stuff every day, that building your way out is going to be extremely, extremely expensive and very impactful. And as a region, we've already made some policy decisions around, how we might manage that. And so these would be beyond that. But in order to inform the conversation, I think we can bring something like that back.
Paul?
One thing I do want to say on this, thank you, is I think we have to look at the other side of that analysis, and that is that if you look at the last 15 or so years of national studies of metropolitan areas as far as it relates to congestion, we've ranked really high in being one of the worst congested areas in the nation. So that's preceded, and that's even gone through the recession period as well, when our economy was slow. And it kind of gets back what I was trying to allude to earlier or talk about, and that is about, we have an undersized system for, in general, and even our baseline kind of suggests that baseline is good or adequate. And I don't think we're saying that, but I think some might look at that and think the baseline is good. But I think there is the question of what is the right size, and are we really there? And because when you speak of cost, there are the economic costs to job production. We are growing. We're growing significantly. Our population is. We're growing in Clackamas County. I can say that we're growing our population faster. We're growing local jobs, and what that means is that there's more need for transportation for people to go to where the jobs are, whether that's in Washington County or Multnomah County. So it exacerbates that in the sense. So that's again, I think it's if we're going to look at that, we need to look at the other side of it, is what is the right size and what are the economic impacts of us being what I would say undersized and underinvested currently.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm checking on the clock here, and I think we actually are just a skosh ahead. So I'm gonna, as I had said, because we had a pretty early start this morning, is there anyone left in the audience who would like to make public comment to the Policy Advisory Committee before we move on to next steps? Thank you, David. Appreciate it. No. Okay. All right. Well, let us move on to next steps then. I think we sent these out to you. I owe you calendar invites, but we have established the dates for the remaining PAC meetings. The next meeting will be February 28th. It's a Wednesday from 2 to 5. I will tell you that as we look to finalize the dates, we did the very best we could looking at all of the very many meetings that you all attend, council, commission, JPAC, coordinating committee, so forth and so on, and did the very best we could to try and dodge around all of them. And so these are the very best dates and times that we could find for the remaining PAC meetings. So we will not be meeting again now until February 28th. I wanted to check back in on some action items that we will be doing as we leave this meeting. One is we'll be finalizing the charter with the changes that we discussed, Ann's proposed change, the consistency between the language in the charter and the Tech Memo 1, or the objectives and performance measures, in terms of the consistency with state and regional law issue, and then the paragraph about bottleneck projects. We'll fix all those, and then we will be figuring out how to gather signatures. So you'll be hearing from us on that. Anne took away a request for status reports on education and engagement activities. We will continue to send you, we won't wait until February 28th. We will continue to send you, as we get them, comments that come in specifically to the PAC email. So we'll be sending those compilations to you. The third thing was to incorporate your comments into the objectives and performance measures. Kirsten was taking very specific notes. I saw that. And then the last request I just heard was for the list of other facilities, or as we call it, a library on other tolled facilities. And so we'll be working on that. And Brendan?
Thanks, Penny. So to clarify that status update that I asked for, just kind of my interest in understanding the conversations that you're going to be having in our various communities. I think it's reasonable to say maybe mid-January we receive something of who you've been talking to and in what forms, and then possibly what you're doing in between mid-January and our next meeting, February 28th. Does that sound reasonable?
I think Judith is nodding. I think that sounds
Yep.
reasonable. Yeah.
Great.
Right. Yeah, we don't really want to keep you in the dark. That's not our intent. We'd like you to be informed and know what's happening and who's being talked to out in the community. And as we provide that to you, if you see gaps, please let us know. Or if you leave here and you think, oh my gosh, there's a group that they really should be talking with, just shoot it. You can shoot it my way. You hear from me all the time. So shoot it my way, and I will make sure it gets to the communications team. Let me see here. Any last words from our co-chairs at the end of the meeting today?
You go first, Mr. Co-Chair.
Oh gosh, this is monthly. I get this picking from him. Again, thanks. I really appreciate the feedback today. I thought it was a very fruitful conversation, a lot more interest, a lot more points, a lot more feedback that is going to be valuable information to this forum, but more importantly going to be very valuable to the commission as we get closer to trying to prepare our submittal to FHWA. I just want to make sure that the group understands that we have to stay very concise in our approach with this, based on what our charge is and based on a charter. So I'm glad that we got to get that mapped out today and able to move forward. One of the things I would highly encourage a lot of folks in here to do is to consider what is taking place up north with our neighbors up in the Seattle metro region, and Chris over here could probably speak more to the specifics of the successes and failures up there. But I would assume, since that's a very close neighbor of ours, that we try to take into consideration a lot of things in their learning lessons up there, things that have worked, haven't worked, so we can be very thoughtful as we work towards solutions down here for our own region. I know we talked a lot today about 2027, and I know this is kind of getting out into the weeds again, but there's a bigger all-encompassing picture here, and just as Marie had mentioned earlier, the rate of technology is moving so fast. We don't even know if what we're saying right now or what we come to a consensus on in this forum is even going to be adequate in 3 years or 5 years. It's so up in the air. But I would definitely encourage everybody to look at, as I had mentioned before, this approach very holistically as it relates to everything, and more importantly, in 2027, what do we want our region to look like? As it relates to everything, not just the transportation system, but our housing infrastructure, our economic development plans, our arterial streets, all of that's all encompassing. The jobs, where are people going to live, where are they going to get to, how are our other modes of active transportation going to function within that whole system. All of that all encompassing is going to be very valuable as we work towards unified solutions here. And so the points that have been made by everybody here today is very valuable, and I'm just excited to keep moving forward and focusing on getting somewhere that we can be very proud of and excited about for our future. Thanks.
Thanks, Orlando. Sean?
Eloquent as always, Commissioner Simpson. And I do want to thank everyone for the input and the engagement. I think it's very helpful, and I think just keeping in mind that our population is growing, families keep growing, people keep moving into the region. That's unlikely to stop. This is a great place to live, and I think congestion isn't going away. And I think that we can't buy our way out of it. We can't. This investment, this method, is one option, and I think, as I mentioned earlier, we have to take the holistic approach. We have to look at what are the options for people to not be stuck in traffic. Are we creating bike and pedestrian options? Are we creating transit options? People have to move around, and I think we have to, keep that in mind, that to alleviate traffic on the roads, we've got to create other ways for people to get around. So that is not lost on us, that this is a holistic approach, and people do want to get around. But right now, we don't have enough options, and I think we've just got to look at that. Can we incentivize carpooling? Can we look at where ways to ease congestion or to mitigate population growth have worked? And fundamentally, we're still looking at a user fee-based system, and where it's not user fee, to try to make it more user fee. Those who benefit from the system invest in it. We have two options. One is to do nothing, and two is to do something to alleviate that. And doing something is always expensive. Nobody wants to pay for it. But needless to say, adding any kind of capacity to mitigate it costs money, and we have to look at what are the options to incentivize changes in behavior. And I think congestion pricing is one of them, but I think we cannot look at it in isolation. And I think we just have to keep in mind that it's one tool. What we're doing right now is a feasibility. We may come back and say, hey, it doesn't work here, but we have to look at how it has worked, and if we were to say, yes, let's do it, what would that look like? And if we had the green light to say, okay, let's implement it, how would we do that? And really to get to that stage about, does it work here? Is it feasible? And so I think, and giving consideration to all the communities that would be impacted by such a move. But I think it's really looking at, can we actually make a model that could be implemented? And we're not there yet. I mean, delay is up, congestion's up, crashes are up. People are getting more aggressive as a result of frustration, being stuck in traffic. So, and I think we're looking at, you think of systems like Waze is really just trying to network capacity, and it affects neighborhoods and other places. But the legislature has done some big things. They've passed a $5.3 billion bill without it being referred, and we could be looking at all our time right now spooling up to a ballot measure. That's not where we are. They did a bipartisan, bicameral piece of legislation that's directing us and giving us some options. So I hope that with this, we can get to a point where we're starting to go from concept to actually executing a plan that will help mitigate the population growth and the congestion that we're all experiencing. So this process is very helpful. I know it seems long and tedious, but I am hoping that we get to a place on the commission where we can make a recommendation in consultation with FHWA and our other partners. The users of the system don't care whose roads they are. They want to go from point A to point B, whether it's state or county or federal or however. But I think ultimately it is about improving people's quality of life and in making the economy work in the Northwest. And our options are limited, and the demand is high. So I think that's what we're trying to do, and to get to a plan, and greatly appreciate the input and investment of time that people have given.
Thank you, Sean. Okay, with that, I think I'm going to call us cooked. We're done for the day. Thank you so much. You can leave your table tents. We'll take care of them. Have a great day. Have a great holiday season.